This video is going to demonstrate how to use the Entity Framework core on the ASP.NET core to construct a new database web application with all of the views, the controllers, and the models all built in to using the MVC framework. So in a couple of quick, easy steps. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new project. It's going to be this under web.NET Core, ASP.NET Core Web Application. We'll just call this an EF test 1. And I'm just going to leave create directory. I'm not going to synchronize to my Git. From this choice, I have core.NET 2.1 and 2.2. I'm just going to leave the newest version. Yours may be different. Web application right here, model view controller, depending on what version. I'm using Visual Studio 2017 with the latest update packages. I'm going to uncheck configure for HTTPS. My authentication is set to no, and just demonstrating the entire process. So it's going to create this project with the MVC template. So you can see over here to the right, I have my models, my views, and my controllers. Okay, so we've got a couple of things to do, and I've got some steps here that I've created for myself to shorten things. So the very first thing that we have to do is create the model for our database. So to do that, we're going to right click on models, and we can just go here to add, and we could say new item, or we can just go down here to class. And I'm going to create a customer database. So I'm just going to call this class customers, or just customer. So customer.cs gets created, and you can see that right here it inherits this all of these objects for models under the project EF test 1. So I've got some code here that I'm going to use. The first thing is we need a couple of directives here at the top of our model. So we're using this entity framework here, core, and you're going to see how when I have migrations automate the schema that is essentially created by this controller, or excuse me, this model, I'm able to add precision to some of my columns that will reside in a table. And you'll see that here shortly. So the next thing that we're going to do is I've got some code here that what I've got here is I'm going to replace some of my code here. So right now I've just got this public class customer right here, and I'm just going to replace it with some code that I've pre-written. So all I did here was establish a context called my context, and what happens here is you'll see here in a moment where we're going to go to our startup.cs file, where we can add and define our context as the connection to our database. So essentially that this object can see, this model can see our database context, our connection to our database when it gets created. And inside here, instead of public class customer just having nothing, this is what I do for my model is I'm going to create a table. And my table right here is going to be called customers. And so inside here, in where I define my context of my database, I'm going to establish a database set here for the customer. All of these customer right here, these columns that are defined inside this customer class, they're going to reside inside of this customers, which essentially is going to be the table. Okay, so you'll see here in a moment, excuse me, customers will be the database and customer will be the table. Okay, so again, this will be a table that resides inside of this database. Okay, so looking here, because I have this directive up here using system component model data annotations schema, I'm able to further define my schema. So I have public int customer ID. What happens with migrations when it reads this schema is it makes this the primary key. And so there's a lot of automation done with migrations using this approach to sort of code first and database second. So the database gets created through the migrations mechanism you'll see. And so here I'm defining a second column called first name, and so I'm collecting the first name, the last name, the age, and the email of the customer. So I'm setting here in this line 22 that when it goes to SQL Server, which is the database engine that I'll be using, the database server, and I'll just be using the localhost database that's created as an express instance with Visual Studio. And I'm specifying that I want the data type to be in varchar with size 200 in the database table for this column. And then I've got last name, I define that as in varchar 200. I want the age to be an integer value, and then I specify email to store just a little bit more information in case it's needed with in varchar 250. So it's just an example. And you'll see how this gets instantiated here in a moment. So that's really all we need to do for our model. And just to make sure you don't have any, you can always just build the solution to make sure you don't have any compiling errors. Okay, so we've got that. And then the next step is that we need to modify our startup.cs file. So if you'll notice over here on the right, the project creates this startup.cs. And when you open this, you need to do a couple of things here. So in the startup.cs, we need to add these two directives. And let me show you what they are going to be. So at the top, right here, notice that this says name of projects.models. So what that will be here is EF. In my case, it's test1.models. So that right here, the startup can see those objects that reside in our model. And then, of course, we're using the entity framework core. Okay. Then next, we need to add these. There's a configure services method. It looks kind of like this. And you need to locate this configure services method. And that's where you're going to add your context for your database. Essentially, you're going to establish the connection string to the local one, or if you were working in a remote. So you can see again, this configure services method is already here in your startup file. There it is, configure services. And you just come down to the last line inside that method and just insert a new line. And this is sort of where all the configuration is made for your application. And so what I did was I just added a variable here that defines the connection, and all this is my local database instance. The only thing you would need to modify here is where it says database equals whatever name, and so I just changed that string here in my code, and we're just going to call this the customers database. and you want to just match that with what you put in your model. So again, if in case you've forgotten, if you look over here, this is our customers right here. Okay, so we modified that, and again, this is using SQL Server Connection, and we establish our context as my context, and that's the connection to the database. So once we've done that, we've completed the startup. So all we need to do, and again, you can just build if you want. Make sure you haven't created any errors, no build errors, so my build succeeded. And then the last thing you need to do is you have to run the NuGet Package Manager console, and we run this migration where it creates the database based off of our schema design. So to do that, you go here to Tools, and mine's already open at the bottom. So you would go to Tools and NuGet, and right here you've got this Package Manager console. So mine's already open down here at the bottom. It will show up this Package Manager console. And you've got two commands to run. The first one is add migration initial create. So I could just copy that command, or I could type it, whatever. I'm just going to right here. And so add migration initial create. If you've made some kind of mistake, you will see some blatant errors start to pop up right here. For instance, if you screwed up anywhere, the most common mistake made is that your model is screwed up right here. You've done something that violates a schema for a model, and it just doesn't work. Okay, and then you need to fix your model, and then you can go back to that. And then this update database command, what it does then is it makes sure that now that your schema is created, that the database contains all of the entities and columns and definitions of your model. So how do you look at that? If you go to View, and there's this SQL Server Object Explorer, and you expand mine right here, this is my local database, you will see that a customers database has been created. So when I expand that and I go to tables, you'll see that it created this migrations history, and that keeps track of. Remember, migrations is used to comply with schema. It can also be used in case there's a change to your database model. It's possible to update your schema design, and the history is recorded inside this migrations history table. There's also my customers table, and inside that you'll see here my columns, and you can see that the columns, first name, last name, age, email, comply with my model. When you go back to the model, you'll see here when we created these columns for our schema, it then complied with those data types. So that's how you make sure that your model is created exactly the way you want it in your database. Okay, so then the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to create the views and controllers for this web application. And if you go here to your project and you right click, or excuse me, if you go under where it says controllers and you right click and you go here to add controller, it's going to pull up this wizard, and you've got some choices. The one you want to pick here is MVC controller with views using the entity framework. And watch what happens here. So I'm going to go ahead and click add to that. And what you want to do is you want to choose which model or which class contains your data model. So ours, we know it is the customer class that contains our data model, and then which context did you create that connects to the model right here, and we called that my context. So once you choose these two things, all you need to do is click this add button and let Visual Studio do the work, and it will create the controller and all of the views, and you'll see those in just a moment. And your web application is complete, and you'll see how it creates views with forms that allow you to add, update, delete data in your database. So if we expand, once that's completed, if we expand views, you will see now that in views there is a folder called customers, and inside that you'll see that it created a create view, a delete, details, edit, and index. So let's see how that works and how we can access that in the URL. So make note of the folder it creates under views, customers, and you'll need to know that in order to determine how to get to the URL. So if I run IIS Express in Visual Studio, it will access the home controller first, and then you'll see it assign a random port, and this is just the default view. And if I just do a / and we choose, again, our view folder was called customers, you will see that now you have a fully functional web application that communicates with the database. So I can create a new item, and I'll just put my name here, and notice that it created the form here. I'll put my name, my age, my email, click create. It adds an item to the view, and I can click on details. I can go back to the list. I can edit, make a change if I wanted. I can go back to the list, and I can create a new item or go back to the list. So that is, in just a couple of few short steps, how you can create a fully functional web application using the entity framework inside of the ASP.NET Core.